Good evening, everybody, for architects and students and universities in India. We have been joined by universities in Southeast Asia as well. It gives us great pleasure in inviting Professor Jean-Louis Cohen to the series of architecture talks on the Council of Architecture of India COA Social Reads Forum. Welcome, Professor Jean-Louis Cohen. The forum,
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. The forum really reaches India, Southeast Asia. We have Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. So it's really a very large forum that's grown over the last 1 year. The title of today's talk is very intriguing. It talks about Louis Corbusier's politics between Naiveté and Opportunism. Let me briefly introduce Professor Jean-Louis Cohen, though he doesn't need any introduction. Jean-Louis Cohen is an architect, historian, and a curator with a long track record in research on modern architecture and city planning. Since 1994, he holds the Sheldon Solo Chair for the History of Architecture at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. He has been a curator for numerous exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and the Pompidou Centre in Paris. Some of his significant books, among the over 40 books or more that Professor Cohen has so intensely researched and shared with us, is Building a New World, Americanism in Russian Architecture. And here I may point out that Professor Cohen is one of the first and maybe only researcher of Le Corbusier's work in Russia, if I may add to that. And it's a very intense research on Russia. Not much was known about Corbusier in Russia, and I think that has also been a source for the talk today. Another book is on Frank Gehry, a catalogue raison of the drawings, volume 1, 54 to 1978. And then the Le Corbusier, an Atlas of Modern Landscapes, which was published in 2013, really relooks at Corbusier's relationship with the landscape and nature, the future of architecture since 1889, and the other books are Architecture in Uniform, Designing and Building for World War II, Scenes of the World to Come, and then Le Corbusier and the Mystic of the USSR. Jean-Louis Cohen, as I've already said, is probably the single most important scholar of Corbusier in the world today, as described by Professor Michael Hayes at Harvard, and I had a glimpse of that conversation. And Jean-Louis was one of the first to study the Russian works of Corbusier and oversee the definitive volume of Towards an Architecture. We grew up on Towards a New Architecture, and we had to completely revise our reading with Towards an Architecture because it made such a difference. Even in that famous quote that says, it's a machine to live in, and you reinterpret it as machine to reside in, and the nuances and the manner in which that whole narrative changed, and we're grateful to you for that. I have a copy of this huge book, Le Corbusier Le Grand, which Jean-Louis kind of collaborated with Tim Benton, and it's a heavy book. It takes 2 or 3 architects in my office to bring that book onto the table. And it's a huge book, but it really kind of reveals a whole narrative documentation on Corbusier. So I'll briefly read the abstract of the talk, and we really look forward to Professor Cohen's interpretations. Some complex, some contradictory, some problematic, because that was the personality of Corbusier. And I think at the end of it, we are very keen to even engage in a short dialogue with Professor Cohen on these insights and how they were revealed over time. Le Corbusier Politics Between Naiveté and Opportunism. The abstract, triggered by the publication of several books since 2015, heated polemics have developed on the political engagement of Le Corbusier with the leading forces of the first half of the 20th century. Yet the view shared by these authors of a man viscerally committed to the right doesn't resist a more comprehensive analysis of his political passions. Corbusier has also been engaged in a cyclical flirtation with the left and other political forces, I assume. Moreover, it's perhaps about time to consider him less as an agent of political power than as a manipulator of power in order to achieve his own architectural and urban goals. We now invite Professor Cohen to share his research and insights on the theme. Welcome, Professor Cohen.
Many thanks, dear Durganand, for this flattering introduction. Many thanks to everyone today. In the end, the benefit of this pandemic is to allow us to have this a kind of conversation which would otherwise be very difficult to organize. Many people would have to take airplanes, including me, to go to a particular place, and I think it's a good thing that we can really exchange ideas. So let me start with the title of my presentation of today: Le Corbusier's politics between naivete and opportunism, between his belief to a such simplistic belief in the virtues of politics and the use he made. Let me say a few things about my relationship to this extraordinary figure. I really love this photograph by Lucien Hervé of Le Corbusier looking out from the Secretariat building in Chandigarh at the High Court with his sketches, with his sketchbook and his pencils, in a way trying to record what he was doing in India. India will not be in the center of my story today, but is of course an extremely important aspect of Le Corbusier's work. My own work with Le Corbusier has been mentioned by Durganand Balsavar, and I started, I've never met him. I was born in 49 and I was still in high school when he died in 1965, but his shadow was everywhere in French architecture when I was a student, and I started very early to go to places to meet with some of his collaborators who became friends and started writing. So this book on Russia, which has been mentioned, which was based on years of research in Russian archive. The centennial exhibition at the Pompidou Center in 1987, which I created together with Bruno Reichlin, and really a vast quantity of investigations about his architecture and his urban design, including this exhibition on entitled An Atlas of Modern Landscape at the Museum of Modern Art in New York now 8 years ago, which was, I think, significant because and in which this image was used very monumentally to challenge the idea that Le Corbusier was indifferent to landscape, that he was producing typical buildings which could be repeated and without paying attention to landscape. And all his designs and his discourse proves the opposite, especially his engagement with the landscape in Chandigarh, which is particularly a significant part of his work. So now let me, politics. Le Corbusier and Nehru, this is a very well-known photograph, which shows us that one of the major strategies of Le Corbusier to get to work was to socialize, to create relationships with political rulers. This was a way of implementing what American 19th century architect Henry Hobson Richardson considered, it's a very famous aphorism, as the first rule of architecture. What is the first rule of architecture? You will ask. It's very simple. Get the job, get the commission. Then everything can follow. So in a way, Le Corbusier was active during his own life to get the jobs, to get the commissions, and this is what he managed to do in India. But the story, if I say two words about the origin of the commission for India, is a very precise one. As everyone in India knows, the first plan of Chandigarh and even the first buildings were designed by Albert Meyer and the American planner, and by Maciej Nowicki, Polish architect who died in 1950. And if Le Corbusier got the job, it was because of the political connections of newly independent India and the French state. He got the job because the French minister of housing and planning recommended him to the Indians, said that he was, so he, in a way, his engagement in French post-war politics was the very source of his of the commission he got to draw the master plan of Chandigarh and then a series of buildings. So all these things are woven together in a continuity. In the past years, especially in 2015, the 50th anniversary of Le Corbusier's death was celebrated, but in a very scandalous atmosphere, where a series of writers underline Le Corbusier's dealings during the German occupation of France. And this is what you can see here, the Nazi flag on Rue de Rivoli in Paris. Le Corbusier worked during the German occupation. He never went into hiding. He was not only marginally and very late part of a resistance. He spent a number of months in the courting the collaborationist government of Maréchal Pétain, the government which was helping Germany to continue the war. And this led to a series of recent polemics. In the book on the right, a journalist called Xavier de Jarcy considered that Le Corbusier was an agent of French fascism, which is a vast exaggeration, even if some of his friends became fascists. And this is something I will discuss. And this book of 2015 is just an echo of former books in which Le Corbusier had been accused, the two on the left, of being an agent of Moscow. So around 1930, Le Corbusier was condemned for being close to the Soviets, which he wasn't, although he had worked in Moscow. So in a way, as André Malraux said during the state funerals of Le Corbusier in 1965, he had never ceased, Le Corbusier had never ceased to be aggressed, to be criticized, to be blamed, in particular for political positions which he never completely endorsed. And here I want you to read with me this quote of 1930. Le Corbusier was writing to Hélène de Mandreau, who was, this lady was the hostess of the first CIAM, the first International Congress of Modern Architecture, in her castle in Switzerland in 1928. And here you see, read what Le Corbusier writes: politics, I am colorless, as the groups created in support of our ideas are Redressement Français, militarist, Lyotet, bourgeois, that is right-wing, communist, socialist, radical, League of Nations, royalists and fascists. And his conclusion is simple: when one mixes all the colors, as you know, we get white. So it's a statement about, in a way, his indifference to politics, which was largely true, not fully true. In a way, it was a zero-sum game in which his adventures on the right equaled the adventures on the left. So I want to insist, as I had done in this Harvard lecture mentioned by Durganand before, I want to today to focus essentially on his relationship with the left, the French left. Le Corbusier, as you know, was a pseudonym for Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, who was born in Switzerland. in the industrial city of La Chaux-de-Fonds, and who aspired, when he started living in Paris, not only at being an architect, at being an artist, at being a writer, but also at being an entrepreneur, as being a business manager. And this is something very important and very little remembered. Le Corbusier in the 1920s identified with the industrialists, with the owners of French factories, because he has his own frustration as an entrepreneur. Here is the brick factory, which he created near Paris during World War One. And what he says substantially, and I don't want you to read all these long quotes, but he complains in 1919 to his friend, the Swiss writer William Ritter, that the strikes of the workers is hitting his business. So in a way, he was, by his very function as a small and by the way, unsuccessful businessman, rather drawn to the conservatives. Le Corbusier had some models in terms of politics and industry, and I will not be very long, but I just want to signal that in his youth he had worked in Berlin, where his employer for a while was Peter Behrens, who was at the service of this man, Walter Rathenau, a very important German statesman, minister of war industries during the war, minister of foreign affairs, who was also writing about the future. And it's not a coincidence if the book of Le Corbusier, Vers une architecture, Towards an Architecture, was translated in German with a title very close to that of the book here by Rathenau. I'm going back a little more. What did it mean for Le Corbusier to be born in La Chaux-de-Fonds? La Chaux-de-Fonds was a small industrial town, which was extremely important in the worldwide production of watches. Before 1914, La Chaux-de-Fonds produced 50% of the worldwide output of watches. So the city was, could be considered as an anti-manufacturer, as an anti-factory. And Le Corbusier's father was active in this production. He was a small artisan, and he was collaborating with the big bosses of the industry, whose children would give some jobs to the young Le Corbusier when he returned from his formative trips. Le Corbusier was, or rather Jeanneret before 1914, his name before 1920, sorry, was very sensitive to the political atmosphere in his hometown. What you see here is a very strange object, which I found in the archive of his cousin Pierre Jeanneret. These are the articles Jeanneret, Charles-Édouard, the future Le Corbusier, sent from the east, towards the east, from Greece and Turkey, which were printed in the local newspaper of La Chaux-de-Fonds in 1911. And they were glued by Jeanneret's father on this catalogue of alpinist supplies. But what is important here is to see Jeanneret, and again, I don't want to read in detail the quote. Jeanneret was very sensitive to the political atmosphere in his hometown. The department he had created in the art school was closed when the municipality turned socialist. So the quote you see here is a sort of self-criticism, a rejection of the socialist ideas he had initially. In this context, the relationship to Germany was extremely important. I won't discuss it in detail, but he found in Germany inspiration among architects like Behrens, among industrialists like Osthaus, who was a patron of arts and design, and one of the very first book he started writing during the war, the First World War, was a comparison between France and Germany. You see this layout sketch on the right, France or Germany, comparing the developments in the two nations. So a very acute understanding of Europe's political situation. After the war and the revolution in Russia, as you know, Russia was shaken by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The political situation in Western Europe was very tense. This poster, this frightening poster, shows us a caricature of a Bolshevik as a criminal threatening the peaceful life of the French citizens. It was a voting campaign poster, which gives you a notion of the atmosphere. In this context, Le Corbusier was drawn into a dialogue with the communist left, which is completely unknown, which was completely unknown until I started digging it up. He was raised, as I said, by his father, a small artisan, by his mother. Here you see a letter, a drawing of his mother, and the text of a letter she wrote to him in November 18. This is the moment when a very modest, a very timid revolution was hitting Switzerland, and her mother was expressed a fierce against the revolution. A parenthesis here, which is more psychological and personal, but very important for Le Corbusier. From 1907, when he first left his hometown to go to Italy, to 1960, when her mother died at the age of 99 years, he never stopped writing her. He wrote her every week. So this correspondence has been, and sometimes twice a week. So these are thousands of letters which have been now published and which are an incredible source to understand Le Corbusier's own positions. Interesting, why? Because his elder brother, who was a musician, was considered as the genius of the family. And he had to demonstrate to his mother week after week that he was the best. So out of this frustration, we know this situation in many families around us, perhaps our own. This is what Sigmund Freud calls the family novel. But in the case of Le Corbusier, it was very characteristic. So we know much about his political ideas from what he wrote to, and what her mother wrote to him. In 1922, Le Corbusier made it big in Paris, and this is the first of a series of urban plans, of urban designs at large scale, which led to the plan of Chandigarh, the contemporary city for 3 million inhabitants, shown as a diorama in the Salon d'Automne. This project was criticized by many, including on the left, Jacques Ménil, who was the critic of a communist newspaper, was sympathized with Le Corbusier's ideas, but criticized his architecture, saying, as you can read it, sorry, why create in the center a shadowy, totally insalubrious core, when the solution of expanding of urban surface appears as more logical and also more consistent with the development of existing cities. So in short, in favor of garden cities, Le Corbusier mentioned some of them in his project, and against the very dense city center, which will remain a feature of Le Corbusier's designs for a long time. At that time, Le Corbusier was looking for a title, and here I'm glad, Durganand, you've mentioned towards an architecture. He was looking for a title, and his first title was what you see here, Architecture or Revolution. So a typically political title, discussing architecture in the context of politics. And here I'm showing you a little note, handwritten note by Le Corbusier about Ménil, addressing Ménil. And what he writes is very, very clear. Urbanization is a formidable adversary of the agitator. It deprives him of his raison d'être, of his daily bread. What does he mean? That by solving urban problems, by solving the problem of housing, political agitation becomes meaningless. And this will result to the famous final sentence of Towards an Architecture. You see here how he wrote this sentence on with a pen on the typoscript. And I think this detail, sorry, is very important. You see here, architecture. Sorry, I have a problem with this pointer. Architecture or Revolution. So this was the first title, the conclusion of the book and possibly his title. And then he adds, revolution can be avoided. How can revolution be avoided? Thanks to architecture, by providing good housing to the masses. So you realize here how intense was this political question in the first years of Le Corbusier's campaign to seduce the public opinion. Then this program continues when he goes to Moscow in 1928. And this is a very important episode for all sorts of reasons. The Russians at that time were hiring Western architects, essentially Germans and Swiss, to build their new towns. Le Corbusier was invited to participate to a competition for the headquarters of the cooperatives. And he took this opportunity to as you see here, to give a lecture on the future of the city. He became friend with a major figure of Russian constructivism, who was Alexander Vyesnin. I think one sees him on the right of this picture. To the point, and this is something I want to share with you, that he gave to the Russian drawings, which are still kept in Russian collections today. So he felt a very strong sympathy for the Russians, despite the admonition of his mother against the bloodthirsty Bolsheviks. And the result was the Central Soyuz building, here seen in construction, completed in 1935, which remained the largest structure built by Le Corbusier until the completion of the Marseille block, the Marseille Unité d'Habitation in 52. This is something one tends to forget. The largest structure of Le Corbusier for nearly 20 years was the building in Moscow, which he never saw completed, by the way, never saw it completed. So what he meets in Russia is political ambition, is the idea that grand projects are important. And this is what he will translate in his own understanding of Bolshevism. As you probably remember from your history books, Bolshevism, the Bolsheviki means the majoritarian, the members of the majority group inside the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party before 1914. Sorry to be very, very specific about it, but Le Corbusier had a different reading. He took the term Bolshe, which means more, which is the comparative of large, of big, as a sort of program, saying that the Russians were about grand projects and hence had to listen to him, who had the same grand projects in the sphere of architecture. And this theme is present in his readings of that period. For instance, when he reads Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, which is one of the fundamental books of Enlightenment political theory, political philosophy, he underlines the parallels between, you see on the upper right, USSR, he seems to read in Rousseau the origins of his project of a grand new society. And this, of course, will be connected with the French political situation. And now I'm returning to Paris. The left-wing critics were embarrassed. This one was a cinema critic who wrote in the same communist newspaper, saying that Le Corbusier, just read the last sentence, Le Corbusier does not believe in class struggle. Only one thing counts, the plan. So despite his admiration for the Russians, he was considered by the French left as being exceedingly apolitical. This was Moussinac's critique. Another critic, and again, this lecture is recorded, and I could, Durganand, send you the PowerPoint, which you might disseminate and send to everyone interested. Here is another left-wing critic, Roger Ginsberger, who was, by the way, the brother-in-law of Richard Neutra, the Viennese architect who had emigrated to Los Angeles. He makes exactly the same critique. Le Corbusier is apolitical. And in fact, he was engaged in the 1930s in a group which was particularly complex and contradictory. The group of young reformers who published magazines, journals such as Prélude and Plan, and who were trying to propose a political line which was halfway between the Russians and Italian fascism. So here, for instance, we see on the right in this newspaper called Prélude, you see a page which is celebration of his a volume of his complete works to Mussolini, to the ruler of Italy, celebrating what Mussolini had said in favor of modern architecture, of young architecture. And he tried hard. One has, in a correspondence, found the evidence. He tried hard to invite, when staying in Rome, Mussolini to an evening where he would have shown him slides of his projects. So he did a lot of work to convince Mussolini, but the conservative Italian architects prevented this from happening. He was in particular, yes, Mussolini had, under the influence of what you see on the left, the panel or a table of horrors, which had been a collage by the young critic Bardi against conservative architecture. Mussolini has supported the Florence railway station by Michelucci, the construction of post offices, of modern post offices, and Le Corbusier was drawn to this image of fascism as supporting modern architecture, which was only partly true. Very complex story. Yet, at the end of the 1930s, when the fascists and the Nazis bombed Spanish cities during the Civil War, Le Corbusier was on the side of the Republicans against the Italians and the Nazis. So in a way, the 1930s are a very complex period where changes in the political situation appear every week. And in this context, Le Corbusier slowly abandoned his idealization of fascism. He had a better time with the left. And here I'm mentioning a few leaders of the left very rapidly. One of the main parties was the so-called radical parties led by the man you see on the left, who had been a minister and who had been instrumental in having Le Corbusier build his famous pavilion of l'Esprit Nouveau in Paris in 1925. So his first very public manifestation after 1922 had been made possible by a left-wing minister. The socialist commented very favorably on his work. This is a socialist activist who wrote in 1930 a piece on socialism and architecture, celebrating Le Corbusier as a revolutionary. Here is a very interesting little book, which is a handbook of architectural history for the trade unions, for the left-wing trade unions. And you see the title, From Pharaohs to Le Corbusier. Pharaohs to Le Corbusier, the idea that he was representing an extremely positive alternative, the new aesthetics of Le Corbusier you see on the right. And he created very close connections with a series of mayors and local politicians. One of them is André Morizet, whom you see here, the mayor of Boulogne near Paris, where Le Corbusier had his own house, by the way. Morizet published a book on Haussmann and his predecessors on the transformation of Paris in the 19th century, which really went into the direction of Le Corbusier's interest for Haussmann, for the man who had modernized Paris. So a very strong connection with Morizet, which led to the project you see on the right for a grand square in the city of Boulogne on the doorsteps of Paris. Not built, unbuilt. 38 was a little late, the war was coming. He also, Le Corbusier, tried in the 1930s to promote a project for the urban renewal of Paris. You see this scheme with long housing, indented buildings, which were present in his 1922 project, but had been reshaped according to his experience of Russian communal houses, which he had seen in the late 20s. So he tried for around between 1935 and 1938 to sell this project to a government of People Front, which was then ruling France beginning in 1936, a left-wing government. You see here a demonstration of the united left parties, the so-called Popular Front. In this context, Le Corbusier was drawn to the idea of building new types of structures which would respond to the expectations of the time. So in 1936, he designed this center of popular festivities, which was a direct response to the proliferation of demonstration, mass rallies, etc. So in a way, this was 2 years after having written to Mussolini on the right side of the political spectrum. He was courting the left. And this is why, Durganand has mentioned this, perhaps, yes, this is why we could say that his political attitude was zigzagging, going from one wing to the next, without changing the projects, taking equal inspiration from both sides. So Le Corbusier, during this period, was part of a very important left-wing organization called the Maison de la Culture, the House of Culture, which had been created by two writers, André Malraux, who later became a minister of General de Gaulle, and Louis Aragon. And he was part of the Union of Architects within this Maison de la Culture, which was very important utopian organization in which all the representatives of creative intelligentsia, writers, musicians, artists, such as Fernand Léger, for instance, and also aux Enfants, the former partner of Le Corbusier, were engaged. So we see him in 36, and this Maison de la Culture promoted movies, new movies, celebrating the revolutionary history of France. This one by famous movie director Jean Renoir, La Marseillaise, was produced in this context. Also in this context, heated discussion took place on the question of realism in painting. So Le Corbusier, again, a few years after having tried to seduce Mussolini, was now in contact with the left-wing workers and their leaders. This one, Vaillant Couturier, was a member of parliament, a very active a leader of the left. And I will give you, it's a little complex, but maybe important nonetheless. I will give you an example of what I call the naivete of Le Corbusier in respect to Vaillant Couturier. In the letter I'm quoting on the right, Le Corbusier pleads for what? He pleads for the deindustrialization of Paris, the cleansing of the unlivable illegal areas of Paris. So the idea of, and it was a very popular idea at that time, that Paris was too dense and that industry had to be decentralized. But what was he thinking he was doing? Le Corbusier was writing to a leader of a political party which found precisely its voters among the workers he wanted to expel from Paris. So this message was clearly the wrong message, or the right message sent to the wrong person. And this is what I call naivete, because he had not analyzed what were in the end the political interests of the person he was writing to. So, but he kept a very narrow contact with this man who died rather early and was a remarkable political intellectual. He was also in contact with Aragon, one of the most important French writers of the 20th century, who was also a communist. And you see on the right a letter in which he is asking Aragon to support him in his endeavors to regain influence in the Soviet Union. And in particular, the dissemination of his books. What you see here, you see at the bottom, the point 9 at the bottom is tell to Moscow they should invite me. And here also a figure, $5,000. Le Corbusier was still waiting for the honorarium for the Central Soyuz. And so he used, in this case, he used politics, the communist writer, in order to try to get from the Soviets the money he was expecting. So you see the level of naivete on one hand in discussing with Vaillant Couturier, in pleading, and cynicism or opportunism in using these connections for his own interests. When Vaillant Couturier died in 1937, Le Corbusier was invited to a competition in order to build a monument. And here, I think we find a very important moment which leads to further developments. This is the fabulous photomontage for this monument, which was to be meant to be built on a large highway, and which was probably the first monument ever designed to be seen from a moving automobile and not by pedestrians. So you see the idea of a huge sign. And if you look at the monument, you see a series of features. It is sculptural and it contains three main themes. One is Vaillant Couturier's head. One is the book, because he was a writer of books, the head of the speaker, of the orator, and the hand, this open hand, this hand reaching out of a building, which of course rings a bell in India, and which has a very particular, a very specific political origin. What is this hand? This hand is the one, the main communist leader, Torres, hands out in a speech of 1936 to the Catholic worker. It's a very important political statement from the communist left. The communists were secular. They were anti-religious until then and very vibrantly. But what changes in 1936 in front Of course, do not forget that Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy were threatening the peace in Western Europe, were becoming extra powerful. So the idea of the union with the Catholic workers was an important one. And so the hand which we find on this monument here and there is the hand Torres reaches out to the Catholics, which becomes a main theme. And here you see the combination of all these elements. The central motif of the project comes from one side from the painting of Le Corbusier, a painting of 1930, and leads, announces the sculpture. You see, in particular, the idea of a frame here, the sculpture he will develop in the later years. So this is 1938, basically, for early 39. In 1940, France loses the first part of the war, the Blitz War after the German invasion, and Le Corbusier is suspected of being a communist agitator. And here is, for instance, a report I found in the police archives inquiring about Le Corbusier's political dealings. In his book of 1938, Cannons, Ammunition, Le Corbusier was expressing a pacifist position. He was expressing himself against a future war, which would, sorry, a future war, a future war which would, of course, be happen in 1939. And in the first days of the occupation, again, he wrote to his mother, Marie-Charlotte Amélie, about this book of 1938, as if it had been a prophecy of what would happen after the under the German occupation. You read his quote: "This book, rejected by the communists, seems to be the very letter of Vichy's guiding ideas." So he pretends, after the defeat of France, again moving from this time from left to right, if I can say so, that he was one of the originators of the conservative policies of the new regime. And this is on this base, in a way, identifying with the first phase of the German occupation, in which rather daring reforms were attempted. It is in this phase that he can be considered as a negative character, and as someone who sided with the wrong guys during the war. This is the reason. This is the point of departure of the book I was mentioning before. It is also true that Le Corbusier had never ceased to try to appeal to the powerful, to what he called the authority, to the rulers capable of implementing his projects. This is, for instance, as early as 1925 in his book, City of Tomorrow, an homage to a great city planner, i.e. the King, Louis XIV, whom he considered as one of the main representatives of this city building authority. So after the war, after 45, Le Corbusier's flirtation with the conservative and pro-German Vichy regime was forgotten, and he was revived as a positive figure by the left. Here, an article by Leon Blum, who had been a socialist prime minister and became again a prime minister after the liberation, seeing in Le Corbusier one of the makers of the city of the future. And as a result, you know that he was given the job of rebuilding one of France's most destroyed cities. So this is the plan of Saint-Dié here. which was the final implementation of his city planning ideas, but which failed because of the opposition of the local forces, despite Le Corbusier's attempt to mobilize his former friends from the left in favor of this plan. It's a very interesting episode in which the population rejects massively a modernist plan in favor of what I would call the nostalgic reconstruction of a former city. In this phase after 1945, Le Corbusier is definitely center-left, is anti-American, very much opposed to America for all sorts of reasons which I could explain. He is closer to the left and is essentially close to a center-left figure who was also a reform-oriented Catholic, Eugène Claudius Petit. Claudius Petit had been in the resistance. He was a member of parliament and was for 5 years Minister of Construction and Urbanism. He was the one who helped Le Corbusier to build some of his major projects. Here we see him standing in front of the Ronchamp Chapel, and here we see the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille. Finally, the point of arrival of Le Corbusier's ideas about housing. This project would never have been made without Claudius Petit. This building was made with state money in order to rehouse inhabitants who had to leave their houses during the war's bombings, but it would never have happened without the political support which Le Corbusier found no longer among the extremists of the right or of the left, but among the moderates, about the reform-oriented moderates. And this leads me to my last image, which is precisely a letter to Claudius Petit, who was no longer a minister, but was still a very actively engaged in French politics. And Le Corbusier again expresses the same theme as at the beginning of my rapid lecture. I have never been in politics, while respecting those who are in it, the good ones. So the good ones that were once listening to him. I've had a political gesture that's very important, that of the open hand, the day one of the two parties that divide the world for the sake of two different natures, i.e. the Russians and the Americans, forced me to take side, following a moral obligation. So a political gesture, but what you understand here very clearly is that this gesture, the open hand, which had a very precise political connotation in the 1930s, the hand reached out to the Catholic worker, had been transformed into a much vaster symbol of humankind. And in short, I would conclude it here by saying that it is with all these zigzags, all these different types of flotations, and through his ability at assimilate the political language and, I would say, regurgitate it, reshape it for his own purposes and for much broader meanings, that the genius of Le Corbusier is revealed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. Wonderful rendition, and I think quite intense as well as dense. So I was thinking more, because this is the context of India, this is the context of Southeast Asia. While we would raise questions which have a certain resonance with what we are grappling with and struggling with.
Absolutely.
But it would be in the context of your lecture, so I would not move out of this theme, but I think the underlying questions. The first, I think, and this I find a lot of what you presented has a much more profound or deeper value, because beyond, if we were to see it beyond Corbusier, beyond the 30s and 60s, a lot of the issues that you have brought out are actually almost persistent, those contradictions and complexities even today. You know,
Yes.
whether an architect is working with the left, an architect is working with the right, or how he positions himself uh, is something which is a reality even today. It is not as historic as it appears, you know. And which is why, as you rightly put it in the beginning, the focus here is not to pin or crucify an architect as he's left or right, or but to really look at how does this architect negotiate, or how does this architect struggle with these different forces, you know. And so when you say Corbusier said he was colorless, or he writes to his mother to be the good son and say that, you know, I'm not political. I have a, this is just a question, and if you wouldn't answer it, it's fine. Do you think Corbusier placed the humanism of his architecture above politics? That politics looked so petty to him at some deeper level, and it could be anything, but his focus was on some ideal notion of architecture which he had in his mind. Would you say that, or would you, because
Yes.
generally the conversation goes to left and right.
What is very clear is that Le Corbusier sells, if I may use this term, sells the same projects to the left, the center, and the right. So he's not, there is no inflection in his,
Mm,
no compromise in what he does as an architecture. And
mm,
even if he know, sometimes he tries, but he never goes very far. So in a way, politics for him is a medium.
sure.
So that's the main thing. Politics is a medium. The politicians are here, should be at the, he aspires at representing a higher level of values and projects than the politicians, and therefore asks them, insist that they should follow his guidelines. So politics is not the goal, it's the medium.
Wonderful. So would it mean that when there were kind of two Corbusiers here, one who was uh, completely committed to his value of to architecture and humanism, and I think in an earlier talk or an earlier your writings, you brought in the Freudian aspect of something
Yes,
which is manifest and something that is latent and hidden.
yes.
And so, is it that Corbusier? Why would you think that Corbusier has to labor or struggle to manifest that he's not political when at another level he is engaging with these same forces?
Yes, well, I think it's one of the complexities of this period. Everything was political. Everything was political. So Le Corbusier used politics as a medium to build his projects or to get commissions, but also prop, to propagandize his ideas. So he used the loudspeaker of politics and of politicians to find support, and what was also therefore sometimes criticized and stigmatized. People who wanted to kill his projects said that he was too left. This is why he worked for 12 years, for instance, in Algiers,
Mm,
maybe not, well, at least 10 years to build and design more than 10 projects, none of which were built because at the end he was considered as being too radical. So I think he sometimes he suffered in his professional life of the attempts he made, again, sometimes naively, sometimes opportunistically, to have the authorities support him. So it was not always, he never played the role. We know now, we are aware of the role certain architects who remain very close to power had. There are some people like Speer in Germany,
yeah,
Piacentini in Italy, Joffan in
yeah.
Russia, who had a certain cynicism in respect to their own design positions, but Le Corbusier had no cynicism. He believed
Mm,
in his ideas,
mm,
and again tried to sell them sometimes in complete contradiction with the values of the people he was speaking to.
Yeah, sure. If we can take this idea of values and maybe move it to a conversation on the kind of typology or manifestation.
Yes.
How do you see, or where do you think that when Jacques Menil in 1922 writes about the left city, the city of the worker, why does he resist Corbusier's typology? Because it kind of later on reflects what Russia does as social housing.
Yes, but well, I think at that time Russia has not done anything. They only resumed building significant housing 2-3 years later. They're still in the civilian war, so Russia is not the issue. At that time, the leading ideal, the main ideal for almost every reform-oriented intellectual or politician is the garden city.
Okay.
It is the mod, even for the Russians.
Okay.
The Russians start by building garden cities. And Le Corbusier hates the garden city.
Yeah.
He hates it. He was always, he loved it in his early years. And this is, it's very interesting to see how it changes completely his positions in respect to city planning during the war, but mainly during the war. And completely rejects city planning, completely rejects the picturesque urban design of Camillo Zitte, which the Viennese, which he had celebrated before. So it changed, and he's in favor of the dense big city, which has been a set of ideas which come from America through the German prism. So it's another story. How do the main ideas of city planning migrate from one area of the world to the next? So although he's critical of New York, sees in Manhattan a great disorder, a great chaos, he's for a sort of orderly interpretation of the North American vertical city.
Sure. What also comes through in this conversation, and I would say most of your writings, is this weaving of Corbusier's own autobiographical position with his theoretical position. There was no separation of the two. It was almost, so he's born in a family where his father is probably working for a Jewish boss, as you described him. And so I think in one text you write that it's probable that the father comes home in the evening and keeps complaining about his Jewish boss. And at the same time, the early really good commissions that Corbusier gets are again from the children or the generation of the same Jewish family, So does that set up a certain contradiction for Corbusier and how to position himself in this kind of context?
No, that's what makes him interesting. Otherwise, he would be unbearable as a human being. It's all these contradictory aspects, and this also there's a difference between the public and the private figure. So if we take this question of anti-Semitism, which has been raised, which was very widely, I would say, present in the French and Swiss French public opinion at that time. So it was a dominant attitude,
Sure.
But Le Corbusier never made public statements, and he started changing when he had a better grasp of society. So, but of course, there is initially what I would call following Karl Marx, a sort of class base to it.
Absolutely. From that point, because how would you interpret Corbusier at one level collaborating with a political force, and at another level attempting to, the way you presented, I'm just kind of paraphrasing what came to my mind. If I'm not right, you can change it. Because what you seem to be saying is at one level, he did collaborate with a political force because he knew that force could deliver his dream. You know, whether it's the city center in Firmini which fails and then he does other things with it, or whether it is the idea of social housing, but he needed an agency, and the agency became the political force. But at the same time, he is always reluctant and distancing himself from that same force. Would it be right to assume that he is aligning
Yes.
and collaborating at the same time, distancing from that?
Yes, I think he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be on the podium together with the political leaders.
Mm.
All that he wants is doing the project, is the decision, and so
Sure.
he's also operating behind the scenes,
Mm.
behind the scenes through correspondence, through his agents. He's not, and he's very careful in his published writings not to let anything transpire. So, but at the same time, one of his frequent attitudes, which I have commented upon a long time ago, is what I call the overbidding.
Mm.
So he has a certain manner of interiorizing the discourse of the politicians or of the industrialists. I will give you an example which might ring a chord in India. He worked for the Czech shoe manufacturer Batia,
Mm. Yeah.
which is very present, was very present in India from
Even
the
now is
30s,
present.
even now.
Even now.
So, and built this Batia Nagar city that was one of the new towns. So he tried to work for Batia. I pronounce it the Czech way, Batia,
Sure. Sure.
for a number of years. And he designed in 1935 a system of stores, very pioneering system of shoe stores for Batia, which could be industrialized and built in many cities. And when you read him, he's teaching Batia how to sell shoes. So it's not only the way he will teach the Russians to be better Bolsheviks by building his projects. So this is another example of what I would call a sort of boastful naivete, trying and in the end it fails also because his clients find him unbearable. If I tend to psychologize the situation because they think that he's doing too much, that he will not take their seat, but will take too much space. So but this passes through this overbidding. He's asked by Batia to be in a competition jury and to give some ideas about planning. He returns with a plan. The
Mm.
same thing with the Soviets. He's asked to design a building in 28. He comes back proposing to reshape the entire city. So there is this, you can call it generosity, you can call it ambition, you can call it aspiration of grandeur. For me, it reveals also one of, I think, the most compelling and probably positive aspects of what architecture is, which is not being happy enough, like engineers solve technical problems. They won't challenge, in most cases, what the question which is asked. They will solve it. Only the very, very grand ones can do that. Architects tend to say, okay, and this is not the right question. We have to reshape the problem in a different way. And so this is what I think is also touching in Corbusier's responses, which are, of course, always, sometimes we know today, the response of a honest designer can be, you don't need a building. There are other ways of solving your problems. For Le Corbusier, there was no question that there had to be a building.
Absolutely. Wonderful. See, and since you brought in Bata, I'll say Bata because
Say
in India
Bata,
we say
your way,
Bata
yes.
and Mokum. So another discussion that was underlying your presentation was that Corbusier was not only having pre-decided thoughts, but each time he went into a certain culture, whether he went into Moscow, whether he went into Prague, and that experience of I think you're right about the experience of the Bata city center show, where they have this big show with people
Yes.
and that kind of makes him rethink about what a city center can be, you know.
Yes.
And could you, because that was to me a very uh, new thought, that something happening in Prague, and he sees it from a shoe company and sees a certain scale, and then starts reimagining a city center of music, of, of celebration, of festivity. Could you elaborate a little more
Yes.
on
Yes.
how that happened?
Batia was a very complex system. I mean, Batia was born out from a small town called Zlin in Moravia, east of Czechoslovakia. And this small town, which is still existing, is what I would call together with Chandigarh, is probably the only other purely functionalist city ever made, because it's and in this city of Zlin, where you had a rigid differentiation of housing and production, it was the prototype for Batanagar, for Bataville in France, for Batawa in Canada. They were a very early multinational, using architecture in a very subconscious way, but the component of culture was very present. So in a way, when you look at Le Corbusier's plan for Zlin, the plan he made, many things announce Saint-Dié and Chandigarh. So again, there are key buildings which, for instance, in his plan for Batia in Zlin, you find the spiral of a museum, which will later develop into the museums in Chandigarh and Ahmedabad and Tokyo. So, I mean, there is also what I would call a sort of intertextuality between the projects. So a sort of a process in which the components of this project, the syntax, i.e. the general articulation of urban forms, and the lexical elements, which are the single buildings, are transformed, displaced, reshaped, retransformed in a sort of flux which goes from the moment in which the language begins to be established, maybe the end of the 1920s, to the last moments.
Sure. So I think that's what happens in if you where you mention in Firmini. In this lecture, you've not mentioned it, but your writings show that in Firmini, he was very keen to bring this Bata idea as a city center. I'm not. Was that so, that he wanted to bring it there?
Yes, but in Firmini, he never had the opportunity of working much in the center. So he, Firmini was a mining town. It was a coal mining town, so the presence of industry was very strong. But I don't think I think was already beyond that. And don't forget that in Firmini, he was not the city planner.
Okay.
The city planner was a guy called André Sive, a former student of Perret, was a very interesting professional. Le Corbusier was asked to do a housing building, a church, a stadium, but not the plan, not the plan.
Okay. Because another theme which seems to be unfolding, and this is even the idea of how do you conceive of a city center. And in that conception, if his early work, I think it's the project of the Insalubris, I think you called it,
yes.
The 1920s. And he seems to, I think even today in India, we're grappling with this idea of the traditional city fabric and maybe demolishing parts of the traditional city fabric to build something that is an insert or sits very uncomfortably. Uh, what was Corbusier's position on that? Because while he doesn't write too much on it, or does he write, there are so many drawings of how he does his surgery of Center Paris.
Yes, I think Le Corbusier was, I don't think he had after having dropped his early ideas about before 1914, which were based on the observation of medieval cities and Renaissance cities, there is a very important moment, and I think which leads to Chandigarh and other projects, and maybe I will show you this. I will show you one drawing. Let me look for it, and I will share my screen again.
Sure.
You will see what I mean. It's a drawing which he made in 1915 when he was working at the National Library in Paris on his project for a book on city planning. So let me show it to you. Well, wait a second. Share my screen. And yes, and you see this drawing, okay? It's a drawing of Rome. It's traced. At that time, there was no Xerox, there was no scan. You had to redraw everything by hand using a sheet of glass put on the book. So he did that. And you see these various parts of Rome. The plan was made by Piero Ligorio, the architect of Villa Medici in Rome, in 1661, I think, or 1662. And Jeanneret traced, made a drawing in which he simplified it. He got rid of everything which was fabric and reduced the city to a composition, to an assembly of single buildings. So it's not a city of continuous fabric, it's a city of monument. And he writes here, this could be, believe me, this monumental composition can be seen as a prototype, you read prototype, of a modern city among the trees. So he sees in this simplified version of Rome, where buildings are playing on their own, the base of what he will later do. And I think that this drawing, which he used also in towards an architecture, is a very important base for his discourse.
Sure. But I think there then has also, because you brought this drawing now, would you say that with this drawing, his focus on primary forms
Yes.
as you know, as something to imagine within the city became important?
It's the idea that the city is primarily objects in conversation. And it's more about, and he's not so much interested into the, what I would say, the collective practices of a city center. This is something which is missing from his writings. Even if he was happy to live in Paris and go to the cafes and have his drinks in the cafe and goes to restaurants and meet people, his practice was a very urban metropolitan practice, but his message was a different message. Was about something different, was about the idea of an orderly, of a reordered city of objects.
Wonderful. So which means that something like that had to be facilitated or state delivered if it had to emerge, you know, like Chandigarh. It had to, his imagination of the city had to be state delivered by the state.
Not necessarily state. Again, let's think about this notion of the authority. The authority could be a private business. He quoted Battia, as we know, Bata. He quoted Olivetti. He was in dialogue with Olivetti for nearly 30 years. He quoted Fiat in the 1930s. So he was expecting it from various sources, from governments, from cities, from powerful capitalists. And again, the model here goes back to Berlin. The model goes back to the studio of Behrens, working for Rathenau and the AEG electrical monopoly. So he had a very strong model of the architect as a form giver for an industrial civilization.
Sure. I think stated very well, the form giver of an industrialized city, the contemporary city.
Yes.
If I just for a minute go back, there was one part where you actually mentioned that Corbusier religiously wrote a letter once a week to his mother for some 53 years.
Yes.
I can assume that it must be a whole uh, 40, 50,000. I don't know how many letters that becomes over 53 years. But in that one significant letter that you mentioned in your writing was the fact that, and you brought that here as the possible cover of Architecture of Revolution. And the fact that Corbusier is now dealing with architect, because when we were in the 80s, those sentences from towards that time, it was towards the new architecture, uh, were resonating with us. And if you, in your writings, you say that Corbusier's mother was very concerned, you mentioned it today, was concerned about this micro revolution that maybe happens in La Chaux de Fonds, maybe as a year after the Russian Revolution, 1917 and this 1980. And the paradox is he's writing to her, and you mentioned that he goes to Moscow. Was there a conflict because of that? What have you found?
Yes. No. Her mother was really very scared when he went to Moscow. She wrote him a letter, which I quote in my book on the mystic of the USSR, saying, "Be very careful. These are dangerous people. They're all Jews." So there's a little hint of anti-Semitism. "Be careful, my son. They will use you." And he brushed that away because it's so. It's the first time, after all. Let's realize what it means for him. It's 28. It's the first time he has received the Russians write in the press, the very figure of the new man. So he's received at a time in which most Russian leaders had been in exile in Paris. So you should not underestimate this fact. Le Corbusier represented almost what I would call Paris fashion. So for him, being welcomed in Moscow was something completely new and exciting. And just one anecdote, which is also, which will speak to architects in the audience. He took part to this competition for the headquarters of the cooperatives. And at some point, all the Russian participants wrote a letter to the jury saying, "We don't deserve this project. There is the greatest architect of the world. Give it to him." So I don't know of any other competitions where the architects involved sign a letter saying that they don't want the job, that someone is more qualified than them.
Wonderful. I think this is probably then the only large commission competition where the others participating grant Corbusier but I think you also mentioned that he was never compensated or paid for that.
He was very late. And this is something I'm interested in. And of course, it would be, I would have to spend another life doing that. But if you want to understand how architecture operates, you have to look at form. This is clear. At form, at ideas, but you also have to look at money. Where does the money come from? When does the money come from? How architects are compensated? What is the impact of compensation on the way they work? I'm working currently on Frank Gehry very much. I've just spent 1 week having him speak about his early projects. And it's clear that the question of monies are very important for him. When you read the correspondence, he's very often paid by the hour. He doesn't have a proportional fee. So of course, this has an impact on the time it takes to work on a project. If the client is not fed up and stop him, he can continue forever to develop a project. This is not the obvious case. So in the case of Moscow, Le Corbusier finally got his money just before the outbreak of World War II. And this is, these were pre-1929 dollars. With that, he was able to survive during the war, even with difficulties. So he finally got his money.
You know, I think another, what you mentioned was a very interesting, it's a revelation that a young architect, when Corbusier is young, he actually begins to do a comparative book between France and Germany, you know. And I think it's a time between the 1820s and 1870s and 1920s.
Yes,
That's the
yes.
kind of time that he's
Mm.
focusing on. Uh, what do you think drove his interest? Could it, now I'm just stretching myself a little, I could, at the same time, it was his father as a watch engraver was probably on the verge of losing his job because of
Mm.
industrialization. Would you see a connection between
No,
this, or there's no connection?
no, this is a clever idea, but it's not true.
No,
Uh,
I'm just
the book, no, the book, it's precisely documented in his correspondence with Ritter, the Swiss writer, and also with Auguste Perret, his mentor in Paris. In the early years of the war, Le Corbusier, let's call him Jeanneret, who was a great supporter of Germany, changes his mind. Like many French people and intellectuals or French Swiss, he's impressed by the bombing of the Reims cathedrals by the German army in 1914. So this bombing, which will be very, very well exploited by French propaganda, will turn the French intelligentsia against Germany. And at the same time, the Cubists and all the modernists in France are criticized by the conservatives as being German agents on the side of the Germans, which were, it is true, the first collectors of Rodin, Picasso, etc., were often Germans. So the idea Jeanneret has is to write a book which would say, no, we're not German agents because the Germans have copied France. And the book is a sort of comparative history, and this is what you've seen of a sketch, the layout sketch, France, Germany on the left, France on the right, and we see the parallel developments which show that the Germans have captured French ideas and then have translated and made them better. So a sort of another zigzag, but in which initially the ideas were all French. And he will be extremely hostile to Germany during that time, very critical of expressionism in architecture, although he would be supportive of the Bauhaus, and he would never very much respond in German to people who were writing him in German, with one exception, Mies van der Rohe, the only guy to whom he responded in rather faulty German was Mies. So it's a very interesting story. I've done a little book on this topic, on the history of not an unpublished, but an unwritten book, because he never completed it.
Brilliant, wonderful. And I think you also state that the Germans were copying France and then could do it better because of their ideas of efficiency, organization, industry.
Yes.
I think you state that.
Which is a cliche. It's a cliche also. It's a sort of cliche to say the Germans are organized. I think that the myth of German organization has been created precisely because initially the Germans were not organized. So they had to, it's sort of inversion of what was the perception.
Okay. So it's more perception and myth, you know.
Yes.
I'll come to the last few questions and then we can. Something that resonates, and you said that resonates with India. And I think if you said it started with the communist symbol of the hand speaking to Catholic workers, because that open hand eventually finds its real emergence in Chandigarh.
Sure.
And much after Corbusier's death, I mean, I really didn't really get a chance to see the court of contemplation.
Yes.
But what is fascinating in your research is how Corbusier engages with the open hand and then adds meanings to the open hand based on this zigzag. Could you give a few anecdotes on how he morphs? Because I think in one presentation you discussed how the hand becomes very strange because now it doesn't have a front and a back, but has two fronts.
Yes.
And could
Well,
you elaborate?
I can't go much into details because I've not studied it well. So I've not studied the transformation. But it's true that the what I would call the adventures of the open hand are also part of the intense post-war work done by Le Corbusier on symbols, on signs, on animals. Those you find on the door of the assembly in Chandigarh, in the tapestry of the High Court. So he creates a sort of zoo of animals and forms and symbols, which are all assembled in his famous poem of a right angle. So I think it's also belonging to another important shift in his work after the war, which is the exploration of sculpture, because sculpture he had never made sculpture until the 1940s, and one could say one could draw a parallel between the buildings of the 20s, which are related to his paintings, and this has been demonstrated by many of my colleagues very well. And in the 50s, sculpture becomes a source. If you look at Ronchamp, for instance, Ronchamp has no clear relationship with the paintings, the post-war paintings, but a clear relationship with the sculptures. So anyway, it's trying to be a one-man synthesis of the arts in a conflict with architects who think that the synthesis of the arts is a collaborative process. He's himself all the arts altogether.
Professor, one last question, because I think this has been a wonderful, insightful presentation, and I think we can have many more questions. But I think I will one culmination of a. You seem to reveal a certain ambiguity. I mean, we could call it zigzag, we could call it shifting positions, but there is a certain ambiguity that Le Corbusier seems to hold to give him a certain freedom to engage with even contradictory forces at times, you know, and and then meander through this whole juxtaposition of politics, the juxtaposition of contradictions, juxtaposition of context and diverse cultures. What would be the kind of lesson or the several lessons that an architect can derive from this kind of manipulation, if one may call it?
Yes, I think it's well. I can't give an answer in terms of the content, form, or the details of the design, but I will compare Le Corbusier to Karl Marx. Karl Marx once said, and this is a comparison I often make. Karl Marx was irritated by the dealings of his supporters. So at some point he said, at least I am not a Marxist. And I think that Le Corbusier never was Corbusian. And this is what explains the shock of everyone when he made Ronchamp. No one was expecting Ronchamp. No one was expecting this twist. Even more than someone like Frank Lloyd Wright, you can, well, Falling Water, done by Wright when he was 90, a little like Ronchamp, was a big surprise. So only the great creative minds, scientists, philosophers, artists, architects, are capable of contradicting themselves and of shifting the ground on which they are operating. So if there is a lesson to be learned, it's the significance of anxiety, the rejection of repetition, not being where you're supposed to be. It's it's remaining free creative individuals, and despite all the repetitive and cumulative aspects, this is what Le Corbusier has been able to do.
So thank you, Professor Cohen, for that very wonderful presentation. We've almost been here for 1 hour, 40 minutes, and I think it's a very engaging presentation.
Thank you very, thank
Yeah.
you very much to you, and thank you for your very careful reading of my writings. I see that you know them better than I do sometimes. Thank you very much.
I've been, of course, following your writings very intensely and connecting it with. I mean, there's much more we can discuss, but the Germans and the German happening and Behrens and the AEG factory and the fact that he meets Mies there. I think you have really chronicled. And when I listen to Michael Hayes' kind of introduction to you, or
Yes.
the kind of, one realizes that it's been a very immersive, deep, and if I can just maybe I would like to add this out of curiosity, maybe outside the lecture, but have you really kind of identified why you are fascinated by Corbusier in this case? Have you identified or?
Well, I don't know, but I was trained in the 60s. The school was still very conservative in Paris, so Le Corbusier was, on one hand, an opposition force to the école, was an alternative, but at the same time, he had become a sort of academic figure, a sort of established figure. So I think for me, he represented both looking at the roots of his discourse, finding obscured moments like the Russian episode, working on the connection with Germany, also looking at the repressed consideration of landscape, was a way for me to also to do what intellectuals are supposed to do, which is to criticize, challenge the leading representations in their field and beyond that. So I think that for
Because
that,
I think, yeah, I think the value of your research to us has been that till now we tended to put the master architects at least on a pedestal, and it was a visual kind of analysis of their form, and it got limited to a visual and some analysis, maybe some formal analysis of plan and section. And over the last 5 or 7 years, I find that your research, and correct me if I'm not interpreting, your research is really trying to broaden the ecosystem in which an architect really functions or tries to imagine. And therefore, all stakeholders become important: the authority, the client,
sure.
the capitalist. And I think that broader picture that your research brings, not limiting it to just a form of a building or explaining it in some very visual way, I think lends much more scholarship in countries like India and Southeast Asia, because many of these are generic elements. They are generic elements.
Yes. No, in a way, I will tell you one last thing because I have to leave you.
Yeah, sure.
Often I am characterized in North America in particular as an architectural historian. And for me, and I don't like this term. I think an architect, for me, being qualified as an architectural historian means that you're almost a satellite of the professional field of architecture. And this is not what I want to be. I am much more a historian. It might seem silly to make such a subtle differentiation, but I consider myself as a historian operating in and on architecture, but from a broader perspective. You can't understand architecture by itself only. It is inserted in intellectual history, in the history of labor, in the history of societies, in the history of power. It has to be read through a psychological filter. It can't be too close and too domesticated by the professional discipline. So That's what I'm
Wonderful.
trying to do. That's what I'm trying to teach to my doctoral students, so sometimes successfully.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Thank
think
you very
that
much.
it's a wonderful note to end the conversation, a more holistic, keeping it open-ended and allowing the complexity and contradiction to coexist. Thank you, Professor Cohen, for finding the time and an amazing talk today to us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your attention. I will send you the PowerPoint presentation so you can circulate it for those who want to be able to revise it. Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Good night. Good night.